In the spring of 1922, on a remote farm in Bavaria, Germany, 6 people were murdered in a way so brutal, so strange, and so deeply unsettling that more than a century later, the case still refuses to die. This was not a crime committed in the middle of a city. It did not happen in a crowded street, or behind the locked door of an apartment building. It happened in a lonely place called Hinterkaifeck, a farm so isolated that the silence around it may have hidden the approach of death itself. But what makes Hinterkaifeck truly horrifying is not only the murders, it is what came before them, and what may have come after. In the days leading up to the attack, the family reported footprints in the snow leading toward the house, strange noises in the attic, a missing key, and signs that someone had been watching the farm. Then, after the killings, the animals were still fed, smoke was seen rising from the chimney, and food inside the house had been eaten. It was as if the murderer had not simply come to kill, it was as if they had stayed. And that is where this story begins. Before we begin, if you're drawn to true mysteries, forgotten horrors, and the darkest cases history left behind, subscribe to Rookhaven. Because some stories are too disturbing to be forgotten. Hinterkaifeck was a small farmstead near Gbern, about 70 kilometers north of Munich. It stood apart from the village, cut off from the comfort of nearby eyes and ears. The people living there were Andreas Gruber, his wife Czilia, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, Victoria's 2 children, young Czilia and little Joseph, and a maid named Maria Baumgartner, who had only just arrived at the farm on the very day the murders are believed to have taken place. 6 people, 1 isolated home, and miles of quiet countryside. From a distance, it might have looked like any other rural household of its time. A family farm, a hard life, nothing unusual. But isolation changes the meaning of ordinary things. A creak in the rafters becomes a presence. A footprint becomes a warning. A missing key becomes a threat. At Hinterkaifeck, the remoteness of the farm turned every small disturbance into something more sinister. And the family, whether they fully understood it or not, appears to have sensed that something was wrong before anyone ever found the bodies. In the days before the killings, Andreas Gruber reportedly noticed footprints in the snow leading from the forest toward the farm. What made the sight so disturbing was that there seemed to be no tracks leading back. Around the same time, a newspaper from Munich appeared on the property, even though no one in the household remembered buying it, and no nearby neighbor was known to subscribe to it. Then there were the sounds, footsteps in the attic, strange movements overhead, the unsettling sense that someone might already be inside the house, listening from above. There were other signs too. A key went missing. A previous maid had reportedly left the farm months earlier after hearing noises, and believing the place was haunted. Andreas mentioned the strange events to neighbors, but nothing was reported to police, and no one seems to have fully grasped the danger closing in around the household. That is one of the most chilling aspects of this case. The idea that the family may have been living alongside the shadow of their killer before the attack ever began. Not after. Before. Sometime during the night of March the 31st going into April the 1st, all 6 people at Hinterkaifeck were murdered. Investigators later believed that 4 of the victims, Andreas, Czilia, Victoria, and young Czilia, were drawn one by one into the barn, where they were killed. After that, the attacker entered the living quarters and murdered the maid, Maria Baumgartner, and the toddler Joseph. The weapon was believed to be a mattock, a farm tool later associated with the attack. Even without dwelling on the violence, the sequence is terrifying. It suggests control, patience, a killer who did not panic, did not rush, and may have understood exactly how to separate the family piece by piece. And one detail has haunted the case for generations. Evidence indicated that young Czilia may have survived for some time after the assault, pulling out her own hair in the straw before she died. It is one of the darkest details in the entire investigation, not because of gore, but because it reminds us that what happened at Hinterkaifeck was not only murder, it was prolonged terror in a place where no one came in time to help. The bodies were not discovered immediately. For days passed. During that time, the family failed to attend church. Young Czilia was absent from school, and a mechanic named Albert Hofner even arrived at the farm to repair an engine, reportedly completing his work without seeing any member of the household. Later, Lorenz Schlittenbauer and 2 other men entered the property and discovered the dead. 4 bodies were found in the barn. The maid and little Joseph were found inside the house. But what made the discovery uniquely horrifying was the evidence that the farm had not been abandoned after the murders. The animals had been fed, smoke had reportedly risen from the chimney, bread had been eaten, and meat from the pantry appeared freshly cut. According to historical summaries of the case, the killer may have remained on the property for days. Imagine that, A silent farm, 6 bodies lying hidden within it, and somewhere in that same space, perhaps in the kitchen, perhaps in the loft, perhaps just beyond a thin wooden wall, the murderer moving through the house as though it now belonged to them. Police from Munich took over the case, but from the very beginning the investigation was compromised. The crime scene was contaminated by onlookers and locals moving through the property. Potential evidence was disturbed. The early theory was robbery, yet a meaningful amount of money remained on the farm, weakening that explanation. Over time, multiple suspects were considered, including traveling workers, local men, and even people tied to rumors surrounding the family itself. But no theory ever fully accounted for the strange behavior before the crime, the method of the killings, and the eerie signs that someone stayed behind afterward. 2 names appear again and again in later discussion of the case. Karl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, who had reportedly been declared dead in the First World War, but became the center of later speculation, and Lorenz Schlittenbauer, whose behavior after the bodies were found led to suspicion. Yet suspicion is not proof, and no one was ever convicted. The farm was demolished in 1923, and even though the murder weapon was later reported to have been found hidden in the attic during demolition, the case remained unsolved. Today, Hinterkaifeck survives not as a solved crime, but as a wound in history, one of Bavaria's most famous and most disturbing mysteries. If the murders themselves were horrifying, what came next may be even worse. For days after the attack, life at Hinterkaifeck did not appear to stop completely. The cattle were fed, smoke was seen from the chimney, bread had been eaten, meat had been cut from the pantry. Someone had moved through that farmhouse after the family was already dead. And that detail changes everything, because it means the killer may not have been a panicked intruder fleeing into the night. It suggests someone calm enough to remain there, someone comfortable enough to move through the kitchen, tend the animals, and exist in the silence of that property while the bodies lay only rooms away. Imagine the farmhouse in those days. No voices, no footsteps from the family, no laughter from the children, only the quiet creaking of timber, the sounds of animals in the barn, and somewhere within it all one living person, a person who had already done something unspeakable. That possibility is what makes Hinterkaifeck feel different from so many other unsolved crimes. Most killers want distance from what they have done. They run, they hide, they disappear. But here, the evidence points toward the opposite. Here, the killer may have stayed. And if that is true, then this was not only a murder scene, it became something stranger, almost like a house temporarily occupied by death itself. A farmhouse where, for several days, the only person left alive may have been the one who caused all of it. That idea has haunted the case for more than a century. Not simply that a family was murdered, but that their killer may have eaten under their roof, warmed himself by their fire, and listened to the wind outside while the dead remained where they had fallen. There are many unsolved murders in history, but Hinterkaifeck lingers for a different reason. It does not feel distant. It does not feel sealed away in old documents and fading police notes. It feels close, intimate, domestic. This was a family home, a barn, a kitchen, a place of work, routine, and sleep. And somehow, that ordinary place became the stage for one of the most unsettling cold cases ever recorded. The horror is not only in the deaths, it is in the atmosphere surrounding them, the footprints, the attic noises, the missing key, the smoke from the chimney after everyone inside was already dead. Maybe that is why the case still grips people more than a century later, because Hinterkaifeck suggests something deeply human and deeply terrifying, that danger does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it watches. Sometimes it slips into the spaces above your head while life below goes on as normal. And when people speak of the Hinterkaifeck murders today, they are not only asking who committed them, they are asking something even darker. How long was the killer there before anyone realized the farm was no longer safe? Over the years, many names were connected to Hinterkaifeck, but one suspect returned again and again: Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He had once been involved with Victoria Gabriel. He was deeply familiar with the family, with the farm, and with the tensions that surrounded the household. After the bodies were discovered, his behavior immediately drew suspicion. Witnesses said that after the group entered the property and found the bodies in the barn, Schlittenbauer seemed able to access the house unusually quickly. This was especially disturbing because a key had reportedly gone missing from the Gruber home just days before the murders. Then there was his composure. According to later accounts, Schlittenbauer moved through the scene in ways that others found strange. He disturbed the bodies. He entered the home even though it was still possible the killer might have been inside. Some believed he behaved less like a horrified neighbor, and more like a man who already understood what had happened there. But suspicion is not proof, and that is the trap of Hinterkaifeck. The case is filled with details that feel meaningful, details that seem to point somewhere, details that almost form a complete picture, until they don't. Schlittenbauer remained under suspicion for years, and some even believed certain comments he made suggested knowledge only the killer would have had. Yet he was never convicted, and before his death, he successfully brought slander claims against people who publicly called him the murderer. So was he the killer? Maybe. Or maybe he was simply the unfortunate man, whose closeness to the family, and whose strange conduct on the day the bodies were found, made him impossible to ignore. In Hinterkaifeck, nearly everyone looks suspicious when you stare long enough into the dark. There are cold cases that disturb us because they are brutal, and then there are cold cases that disturb us because they feel wrong in a deeper way, as though the normal order of life was quietly broken and never fully repaired. Hinterkaifeck belongs to that second kind. A remote farm, a family cut off from the world, warnings no one acted on, a killer who may have been near the house before the murders, a crime scene that suggested someone stayed behind, a list of suspects, but no certainty, a demolished farmhouse, a century of theories, and still, no final answer. That is why the case continues to haunt people, not just because 6 people died there, but because the story leaves behind a feeling that never quite goes away, the feeling that the danger was already inside the edges of their lives long before anyone realized it. In the attic, in the yard, in the snow, in the silence between ordinary moments, Hinterkaifeck does not frighten us only as a murder mystery. It frightens us because it turns home into something unsafe, because it reminds us that terror does not always arrive with a scream or a shattered door. Sometimes it approaches quietly. Sometimes it waits in the dark just beyond the window. Sometimes it lets life continue for one more evening, one more meal, one more ordinary routine, before everything ends. And maybe that is why, more than 100 years later, people still return to this case, not in search of comfort, but in search of the answer that history never gave. If you enjoyed this journey into one of history's darkest unsolved mysteries, subscribe to Rookhaven and step carefully with us into the next one, because some places are abandoned, and some stories never are.